The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseWare continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseWare at ocw.mit.edu.
Theologian, cleric, the early 18th century, who had a fascination with a lot of the natural theology speculation of the age. So Paley is a central figure. In many ways wrote one of the most important books. Very, very large. He wrote many books, but including the books that he wrote was Natural Theology, which basically expands very considerably upon Hume's speculations, and Paley was somebody that Darwin was familiar with. Natural Theology was not required reading for Cambridge undergraduates, but Darwin read Paley's Natural Theology anyway, and as you read the book, you notice that it's got a lot of other things than just theology in it. So one of the questions I have to just start out is, why would somebody interested in science and the order of nature be interested in Paley? I just had you read a very short snippet, but do you get any sense of this book of Paley as a scientist? Does he come across with any scientific skills, capabilities?
Or he analyzes things in a very set order. He has a very methodical order to it that almost appears scientific. Stuff that's not scientific.
Yeah, there's a lot of science in this book. I didn't have you read the whole thing, of course. It would take you a month or so. But, he's got chapters in here on instinct, anatomy. It's definitely a book that's drawing deeply from scientific knowledge. And of course, how many people have heard of Paley before? I'm just curious. Okay, a couple of you. All right. Paley sometimes gets short treatment because he's seen as, he didn't quite get the evolutionary picture. But actually, Paley's a formidable intellect. He had a massive capacity for understanding scientific data. In many ways, a mind that you could certainly understand why Charles Darwin would appreciate. Darwin was a close reader of Paley. And Paley has many explanations in here, and many passages that sort of turn up, or anyway, similar types of passages turn up. Not that Darwin is, directly using Paley, but a lot of Paley's speculations and concerns and questions resurface in Darwin, in the origins, in the origin of species. Darwin had my own view of Darwin is that he had a very deep respect for Paley's speculations. Paley was one of the tribe, so to speak. He was fascinated with science, but of course he was a theologian, and for him the science was something that the science was to be put to the purpose of natural theology, understanding the world as a realm framed by God. So, this was very much The science was definitely summoned in support of a certain view of the world. So, in some sense, it wasn't simply open. So, Paley is a key figure here. Paley came up with the classic argument that that the eye and the complexity of the eye was so extensive, so great, that it simply had to be the result of something that had been designed for a purpose. He couldn't imagine how something like an eye, something as complicated as that, could come about through chance. For discussion's sake, we may have we may have a vast period of time to work with, and many different organisms may have cycled through this process, organisms that through this time, organisms that are no longer with us. But even so, who could come up with an eye in all that process? How could that process of cycling through all that time ever have delivered anything like an eye? So this really becomes Paley's key, his key point. But there are many others too. So in many ways, you can see Paley as one of the originators of what we think of today as intelligent design arguments. And intelligent design arguments are what? Yeah.
So the world and the organisms were created by a designer with a purpose in mind.
Okay. Yeah, it sometimes gets to that point, but modern intelligent design arguments sort of point, I mean, they state it a little differently. I mean, it comes back to the same point. And the statement is usually that and Paley really makes a statement similar to this, that the order of nature, elements of nature are simply way, way too complex to have ever been arrived at accidentally. And more specifically, certain types of organisms, organs, are so complex that one can't imagine intermediate steps that would have been any value to the organism. So, this, and then also other series of arguments that holds that the universe and its constants and the way in which it is structured is capable of supporting human life with consciousness. And in the cosmos, something emerging, the chances of something like that emerging, where humans could be sitting in a room talking about themselves with consciousness, are so vastly improbable that it's a much more convincing argument to make that this is something that had an intelligence and purpose behind its creation. So these types of arguments really, many of them, I mean, not that Paley was the first one, I mean, we've already seen Hume, but Paley's often seen as the key person to have originated these types of arguments. And like I said, he's a formidable writer. He doesn't like this deist view that, some great creative force without any kind of personality, just some force, supernatural force, was at the the originator of existence. Paley really argues, and that's what a lot of the people like Franklin and people who are scientifically oriented, but also believed in some principle of deity. But they argued, well, the deity isn't really, an old guy with a long beard and flowing hair. The deity is some principle, some creative principle. And Paley definitely attacks this notion. He says, no, the deity is a personality, is someone who understands humans and has created them in his own likeness. So Paley's trying to move back to this more conservative position. Okay, so let's have a look at the. I just included one of the passages here, one of the key passages, the opening passage, and so he's and this is where he talks about the stone and the watch, and he makes the point that well, what do you make of this opening passage? It says, in crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? For this reason, and for no other, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day. So he sets up this kind of dichotomy between natural objects and objects of human art. And this dichotomy, this contrast works all the way through the book. And so in some ways it's a book with a very simple argument. It's simply saying that we have complexities that cannot be explained through natural random process, and that complexity requires some creative force. And so the book is devoted, chapter after chapter, to exploring those kinds of complexities in organic life. So, okay, there's a parallel here, of course, with Cleanthes, is there not? But in some ways better stated than Cleanthes. Cleanthes, that's very, very dense prose, and when you study it, you get a lot out of it, but it doesn't just kind of communicate to you immediately, whereas Paley really pulls you in. And then his famous, in another chapter, his famous claim that there cannot be design without a designer, contrivance without a contriver, order without choice, arrangement without anything capable of arranging, subserviency in relation to a purpose without that which could intend a purpose, means suitable to an end and executing their office in accomplishing that end without the end ever having been contemplated or the means accommodated to it. Okay, so this is his key, this is really his key thesis. This is what he's, and he comes back to this point over and over again. And, okay, so what sorts of things, note the key word in here. You can find it here. Intend, right here. This word is going to come up. Intend, intentionality. Intention is going to come up. Why is that so important? What do we mean by intend or intentionality? What do we? And this goes right to the heart of design, does it not? Or at least the heart of one aspect of design.
purpose.
Right, a
Or
forethought.
it actually comes and fulfills that purpose to whatever her purpose. It's the one that's thought of beforehand.
Yeah. Claire, did you?
Yeah, just so like with the watch, it was intended to be used to tell the time of day, whereas we don't really know what a stone was intended to do.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. So in the design itself, it reflects a state of mind. There's so intention takes us from, say, the material world back into the mental. That, you know, intention is kind of a word that connects the mind of a maker with the doing in the material world. So this is a bridge between mind and object. And so it comes up, purpose is the word that always shows up with intention. But intentionality becomes a very big part of, you know, one way of seeing the world is it was intended. Somebody intended it to be as it is. And so that then means that through some process, often unexplained, but some process, the world did come into existence after this thought, and that's why, you know, the word appears over and over again. Okay. As I was saying, this is just to show you. This is just the outline of what this book has in it. And occasionally I've had people in this class who get into paleo and they start reading this stuff and they can't stop. I mean, they just really enjoy reading. I mean, because he takes all the different scientific fields and he folds in their findings into his argument. And, you know, he's definitely picked up many of the things that were important. So, in some ways, he's what we call a syncretic. He brings diverse materials together to unify them into a set of arguments. He goes out and he talks about instincts. He talks about botany. He talks about astronomy. He sort of collects data from around, from all the diverse fields that he's aware of, to bring them into a unified argument about the existence of God. So this is a methodology that is fairly impressive and fairly new, this kind of syncretism. And so he's got a chapter on comparative anatomy, you know, the comparative forms. And he has a whole set of arguments about why these forms, which are similar to each other, can be used as an argument for the way in which God works. God works by designing something, and like a millwright can reapply those designs to different kinds of purposes, i.e. different kinds of organisms. Okay, so you can see here the scope of, and at the core of Paley's work is the subject of anatomy. Is it not? I mean, that's what he's really talking about. I mean, he goes into one of the sections I asked you to read. He takes up the eye, and what is he? What does he compare the eye to, and why does he make this comparison? Yeah. Okay, well, he does get into this big argument about the self-replicating watch. We'll come back to that in a minute. But
The telescope?
the telescope. Why does he? What's the point of comparing the eye to the telescope? Yeah.
Well, I did talk a little bit about like how the lenses were perfectly shaped and formed to refract the light into
Yeah.
the eye and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I only had you read a little section. I mean, the stuff on the eye just goes on and on. I mean, it's a very detailed analysis of all the points of refraction and the function, the structure of the eye, and so on and so forth. And he compares this to a telescope. Yeah, Evan.
Focuses on the idea that both the eye and the telescope are instruments, and he has this one quote where it's, "How is it possible, under circumstances of such close affinity, and under the operation of equal evidence, to exclude contrivance from the one, yet to acknowledge the proof of contrivance having been employed as the plainest and clearest of all proportions in the other?" And one of the things that I got that is that, from when I read that, I was like, well, he seems absolutely right. Is there any reason why there would be an argument against that? And the only thing I could come up with was that that focuses very much on the what. What does it look like? How are they physically similar? And it seemed like the argument kind of broke down if you switch it from what does it look like and exactly how does it work to what is the goal of the thing. What do you know? And I'm not sure if this is what he meant by instruments, because when you switch to, I gave an example in my notes here, but when you look at like a dolphin's echolocation and you look at the human eye, they look very different and they don't seem to have any connection, but they both have the goal of aiding the organism to be able to see.
Yeah.
So I was curious what he was really getting at with the idea of an instrument there. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you could speak to that.
Well, he makes a difference between an instrument as a passive instrument suggests, something that aids the senses or aids, whereas the eye itself is not simply a passive instrument. It's more an active source of gathering data and information for an organism. So there is a difference. But you recall what Philo said to Cleanthes when he tried to compare the great machine in the universe with the universe itself, saying, these things are so different that making an analogy is just kind of ridiculous. So in some ways, Paley he's making his argument is more shrewd. He's bringing these two things that one exists in nature and one is a human instrument. They do have a very similar kind of set of, they're very parallel, very similar structures, very similar things that they're doing, except, as you point out, one is sort of a passive instrument that human uses to aid whereas the eye itself is more complicated because it's wired into the system and there's a perception in it through it. And so it's more an active, organic thing. But the parallel is it's a pretty good parallel. And it certainly makes you realize that, right down to the level of detail, these two things are incredibly similar. And if we find a telescope in the field, we come to the same conclusion as we do if we find a watch. So he's moved off the watch metaphor into the eye and telescope, and the eye becomes one of his, he deals with many other subjects in subsequent chapters, but this eye is key. Yeah.
I think what was frustrating to me for a lot of the writing, and I don't know if he addresses this in different parts, that we didn't read, but he seems to ignore the fact that, obviously in the comparison between a man-made object and an organic object, the organic object has change over its lifetime, and that doesn't occur in the man-made objects, and I feel like he never addresses that. And then there's also variance in organic objects, especially when I was reading about the eye. He was talking about how perfectly designed the eye was, but he made it sound like all eyes were exactly the same. If you look at the human eye, even in the course of a human life, it could develop poor eyesight, it could develop cataracts, that changes over a human life. Or if you look at other animals where like a cat eye is shaped differently and has either a membrane or an amphibious eye or light sensitive cells on a reptile's head. There's just there's so many different forms of the eye in nature that I feel like he doesn't address that, and he doesn't address that. To me, the answer to all of his arguments is adaptation over time. And I feel like he doesn't address,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, that there are
Yeah,
so many different forms
actually
of things.
he does have I didn't have you read it. It's just another part of this big book, but he has a whole section on comparative the eyes and their different forms for not all organisms, but he has several in there, and he notes that they have different structures, modifications, or they operate somewhat differently, although they all share a common set of principles and a common set of structures, but they're suited. But yeah, the notion of the organism in time, the organ in time, as a changing, fluctuating thing, is really not where his focus is. Yeah.
And I think like he especially points that out when he talks about the self-replicating watch, and that even if you go back through generations of the self-replicating watch, you know, it still says even at the indefinite point, there still has to be a point where it's designed.
Yeah.
But, you know, using his own argument, if you go back indefinitely through humans, don't you see change, you know, through generations? So.
Yeah. You see, what sort of changes are you referring to?
Well, I mean, it may be unfair to say evolutionary change to him.
Yeah.
But I mean, even in a short lifetime, you can see people are born with different traits. People are born with different abilities.
Yeah.
You know, there's genetic variants where, you know, someone may have a deformity or something like that at birth. You know, I mean, there's just so much that you can see even in a short time span.
Yeah, I mean, he's pretty subtle, and deformities and things of that sort he actually does mention as, you know, objects, results of chance. But I think the main point you're getting at is there is a kind of growth and fluctuation in organic forms that we would never attribute to, you know, a telescope. Yeah, it can wear out or something, and I suppose in some sense, you know, change is about wear, at least aging. But, you know, organic forms really fluctuate in ways that some designed instrument has no capacity to do. And although the objective examination of an organic form, such as an eye and a telescope, at one moment in time is very, very impressive, the more profound fact may be, in fact, in the growth process, and, you know, and that difference may be so great. One could argue that it really outweighs any kind of objective parallel between these two objects at a moment of examination. So what you're getting to is this whole thing of growth. And growth, you know, we don't associate growth with telescopes. And that could be as big a difference as the difference that Philo points out between Cleanthes's Great Machine of the Universe and the universe itself. But, you know, it just hasn't been quite appreciated.
So subhuman eyes don't work.
Yeah.
When he said, just because like it seldom, the watch seldom goes exactly right, that doesn't mean we can't say it was designed without a purpose. So I mean, he does, to me, he kind of did address that point of that there are some people born with bad eyesight.
Yeah. And he says imperfections of that sort don't really disprove or are not arguments that things have arisen by chance, just because, you know, there's some defects. And maybe that fits to the aging, but yeah. Yeah, I know how you feel.
No, I think like what he says about people who have, you know, bad eyesight or things like that, I think that almost kind of proves, like, from a genetic standpoint, it's like that's actually the driving force of evolution and change over time, is that there are these kind of random variances in the population. I think he doesn't acknowledge, I don't know, the change of, again, I just kept coming back to evolutionary thought, and it's really not fair to think in that term, like, when reading him.
Well, it is true that
When he says things like, these things don't happen by chance, then
Yeah.
I say, well, evolution doesn't happen by chance. Then, and when he says, that things have to be, when he talks about all these, forces, that there are like natural driving forces in
Yeah.
populations and in,
yeah.
that would create
Yeah.
these changes. But
Yeah, I mean, when we get to Darwin, we're all sort of sprinting toward Darwin here because, Darwin, when you use Darwinian arguments, then you look back over things, you say, well, I mean, depending on whether you really understand Darwin's arguments or not, but, you say, oh, but, this was explained. This has been explained. So historically, we are still, more than 50 years before Darwin published The Origin. And Darwin read this. But what always interests me is how could we imagine Darwin reading this treatise by Paley and learning something from it that, made sense for his system?
it's like Paley's arguments are kind of unsatisfying, like logically, because for a lot of things he just says, look at how complex this is, and then he says, we can't explain it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think Darwin and probably a lot of people who read it said, why not? I want to explain it.
Yeah,
So.
I think you hit on something, and that's, this stuff is like, throwing out something, a challenge of sorts. I mean, Paley's a challenge to somebody who says, well, I'm going to try to figure out a way to explain some of these things. I'm going to look for explanations rather than acquiescing in, oh yeah, it must have been created through some process. How can I understand these complexities of organic life that he's talking about throughout the book in very, very specific terms? How can I explain them how can I come up with a different explanation? How can I find a different approach? And I think anybody immersed in science is going to see this as, a whole set of research questions or a whole set of questions, okay, let's see if we can find explanations for it. In earlier ages, the body was oftentimes seen as, a spiritual thing, as, created by a creator. It lived for a period on earth, and then it sought its final end in heaven, or if it wasn't well behaved, in hell or wherever. But, the concept of the body through time, when we look at the history of thought and the history of art, we find increasingly becoming more and more realistic. And Paley's a marvelous step forward in that. I mean, if you read this stuff, it's, he really goes into the detail, the structure of the body and so forth. He's pushing this, even as he's trying to use it as arguments for the existence of God. I just have this, this is just a little, this is Robert Browning's a poem and about an artist who is painting for the church fathers in the Renaissance, Fra Lippo Lippi, very famous artist, and he was accused of being too realistic, and he upset many of his superiors because his art forms in his paintings, they could see the faces of people they actually knew, and this really upset a lot of the clergy in the organization that he belonged to. And so Browning wrote this poem trying to capture this moment. And this is one of the clerics saying, as he's looking at Fra Lippo Lippi's painting, he's saying, that's the very man. Look at the boy who stoops to pat the dog. That woman's like the prior's niece who comes to care about his asthma. It's the life. But there, and this is the artist coming back in, but there my triumph's straw fire flared and funked. Their betters took their turn to see and say, the prior and the learned pulled a face and stopped all that in no time. How? What's here? These are the religious authorities. Quite from the mark of painting, bless us all, faces, arms, legs, and bodies like the true, as much as P and P, it's devil's game. Your business is not to catch men with show, with homage to the perishable clay, but lift them over it. Ignore it all. Make them forget there's such a thing as flesh. Your business is to paint the souls of men. Man's soul, and it's fire, smoke. No, it's not. It's vapor, done up like a newborn babe. In that shape, when you die, it leaves your mouth. It's, well, what matters talking? It's the soul. Give us no more of body than shows the soul. So there was this kind of sense in the emergence of artistic forms, of increasing realism. And in many ways, this is the same thing that's happening in the sciences. You know, a greater understanding of the world as a natural space, a greater understanding of the realism of things, the fact that the orders that existed had causal explanations that we could look for in natural events and natural explanations. And, you know, we can look through history and we can find advances in time in the broad perception of the world, both in the arts and in the sciences. And I would suggest, the body as organism, this is Vesalius's Fabric of the Human Body in the 16th century, pulling all apart, looking inside the body, seeing how it functions, and the notion that the human body is made up of muscles, organs, circulation, and skeleton. And he really pulls all these parts apart, and he captures them with great realistic detail. Again, these are advances. There's something happening here. It's very large. There's something happening in the way the body is being perceived. Harvey, the body as mechanism. The motion of the heart. The idea that the body itself may be really like a mechanical thing. So you can see how someone like Cleanthes would say, well, the mechanism, and in some way, this mechanism, this mechanical view of the body is being used or framed in Paley's work as an argument for the incredible ingenuity of the Creator. But you can see what's happening. It's becoming more and more material. And there's this sort of eccentric French philosopher, La Mettrie, who wrote a treatise in the 18th century called The Human Man the Machine, The Human Machine, in which he argued, let us then conclude boldly that man is a machine and that in the whole universe there is but a single substance differently modified. And that's a pretty naked argument of, that's it. There's just material and it gets ordered in various patterns, but that's what there is. So Paley says, contemplating an animal body and its collective capacity, we cannot forget to notice what a number of instruments are brought together. So he's using this instrumental view, but then he's turning it into the framework of, a workshop. Somebody created these things, these instruments, just the way somebody had to create the telescope. But he's applying this to the body. What a number of instruments are brought together, and often within how small a compass. It is a cluster of contrivances. In a canary bird, for instance, and in a single ounce of matter which composes his body, but which seems to be all employed, we have instruments for eating, for digesting, for nourishment, for breathing, for generation, for running, for flying, for seeing, for hearing, and etc. So this progression of observations and this growth of understanding of the physical nature of the world is, for many intellectuals, is not to be resisted. I mean, it's the way of gaining a wider understanding of the world. I mean, obviously, it's not just a nice little march of progress, but things are coming in from many, many different sources, and suggesting that there's a whole way of looking at the world that views it through a kind of naturalist standpoint of using natural terminologies, natural processes for explanation, and constantly trying to push that what the known knowledge is. There was also the work of the great French comparative anatomist Cuvier, who did his traits, elementary traits in the natural history of animals, in which he worked on a whole set of observations that compared the structures across organic life. Comparative anatomy is a subject of, I took a course once in comparative anatomy, and I absolutely adored this course. It was so interesting to see the way in which bone clusters and skeletons and textures and tissues and organs and so forth compared across species. But it became very, very clear with Cuvier's work that the order in nature was repeating itself, that different species shared incredible amounts of common traits, and that you could trace the heart back to the 3-chambered heart or to the 2-chambered heart, but it was, this comparison really was stimulating some pretty profound questions. Why are these things so similar? I mean, why can't, if they were created? And Paley has some answers for this. Anybody remember what he argued in this, these similarities? Why? He says, this is, well, right here. If you just look at the middle here, he says, if the general plan proceeded from any fixed necessity in the nature of things, how could it accommodate itself to the various wants and uses which it had to serve under different circumstances and on different occasions? So all these organisms live in different circumstances. Arkwright's mill was invented for spinning of cotton. We see it employed for the spinning of wool, flax, and hemp, with such modifications of the original principle, such variety in the same plan as the texture of those different materials rendered necessary, of the machines being put together with design, if it were possible to doubt, whilst we saw it only under one mode and in one form, when we came to observe it in its different applications with such changes of structure, such additions and supplements, as the special and particular use of each case demanded, we could not refuse any longer our assent to the proposition. Very much of this reason is applicable to what has been called comparative anatomy. So he's arguing that it just shows greater ingenuity. And the fact that all these organisms show such close relationship, that it just sort of demonstrates an incredible level of ingenuity that's even greater than just designing one. Certainly the eye was, the eye got a lot of coverage in natural theology. And he says right here at the start, were there no example in the world of contrivance except that of the eye, it would be alone sufficient to support the conclusion which we draw from it as to the necessity of an intelligent creator, period. So all his other arguments are supporting arguments, but he goes back to the eye over and over again as the primary piece of evidence. And I won't read. I mean, it's, you know, like I said, there's a lot of very sound, interesting anatomical science in here. He definitely knows his eyes. He's studied them, and you know, I don't actually know how Paley worked. Whether, you know, he actually had done. I don't know that much about his prior education, but he certainly shows vast reading, if not careful observation from actual anatomical sessions. So, okay. With Paley, we have a sense then of what we might call perfect adaptation. That is, everything in the world exists, forms exist as they do because they're perfectly adapted. And this fits into the Christian humanist frame of the world. That is, everything has its place, is perfectly adapted for that place, and, you know, that sort of eliminates any need for change. There's no concept here of, you know, insufficiency. I mean, there is a concept, as he says, that, you know, things may be imperfect or whatever, but it doesn't add up to a destabilizing force for the order of nature. The order of nature is fixed. This is an inheritance from time immemorial, the fixed order. And that sort of framework is, you know, it's a very powerful, reassuring way of looking at things, is it not? See everything as fixed order? You know, the tradition of Christian humanism is imagining as the order of nature as perfectly adapted, or adapted in a stable sense. So it's, you know, it's not going to be. So the word adaptation also means you're fit with your environment. And adaptation also can be used with, you know, instruments, and, you know, they're adapted for a certain use. So the design aspect of a stable order had to be created, and in that creation, it was, you know, created as something that was perfectly adapted. So yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of question about when the history of adaptation and its use as a word becomes prominent, and it's not until later with evolutionists that it's okay. Paley, as I said, definitely, although he imagines the creation as something that has been made and designed, he is definitely someone who argues for the personality of God. This is a section that I didn't ask you to read, but it's toward the end of the book. But I just wanted to point out that this is an important aspect of his treatise. Now that which can contrive, which can design, must be a person. These capacities constitute personality, for they imply consciousness and thought. They require that which can perceive an end or purpose, as well as the power of providing means and of directing them to their end. They require a center in which perceptions unite and from which volitions flow, which is mind. The acts of a mind prove the existence of a mind, and in whatever a mind resides is a person. So this is a argument that, you know, the world as it exists and was created was not simply the product of a creative force, of some, impersonal force, supernatural though it may be. It's an argument that this force was, in some sense, a humane force, or a force that could perceive and could understand and could build in a way parallel to the way in which we understand those activities. So this is an effort to and Dawkins himself, Richard Dawkins, who wrote The Blind Watchmaker, I don't know, some of you may have, he sort of argues, he's a fairly strong adherent to naturalistic principles. He says, our world is dominated by feats of engineering and works of art. We're entirely accustomed to the idea that complex elegance is an indicator of premeditated, crafted design. This is probably the most powerful reason for the belief held by the vast majority of people that have ever lived in some kind of supernatural deity. The complexity of living organisms is matched by the elegant efficiency of the apparent design. If anyone doesn't agree that this amount of complex design cries out for an explanation, I give up. So, in some sense, that says it all. Everybody's straining to understand how all this happened. And, we have many, many different views and beliefs about it. But Dawkins, of course, took a different approach from Paley. So Paley's legacy is really a legacy of anthropocentrism, in which we use the human form and the human modes of operation as metaphors for how things came into existence. We see the world through our own organization. I've given you a couple of links here. We don't have time to explore them here.
So, I guess there's something called the Gaia hypothesis, but then some people refer to it as a theory. It was come up with somebody called James Lovelock in the early 1960s, and then it really came into discussion in the 1970s. But it was a pretty controversial idea that was kind of like an ecological hypothesis that suggested that all of the physical components of Earth, so like the oceans, the atmosphere, the Earth's crust, like all the organisms on Earth come together to form like a complex living system. So in essence, it went to say that the Earth was one giant creature and that it self-regulated. And so it was kind of an explanation as to why there was life on Earth. Because Lovelock, who came up with the theory, he worked at NASA and he did some work with Mars exploration, and he saw the conditions on Mars in the atmosphere, and there was pretty much no way with the elements that compose the atmosphere up there, at least from the samples that they got, that would be able to support life. And then he looked at Earth, and it was like, despite the fact that you would expect for atmospheric conditions to have changed because of like the reactivity of oxygen and how it would interact with other things, there was like some kind of stability in atmospheric conditions. So that was one of his like scientific reasons for why this would be. And so he was saying that the Earth, which he called Gaia, this like self-regulating creature, kind of modified the atmosphere and then also modified like the salt levels in water, because I guess you would have expected for those to go up over time because of like minerals in rivers and ponds that would have gone into the ocean. But yet the salinity has stayed pretty constant, and if it hadn't, a lot of animals and like organisms within the oceans would have not survived because of like salinity tolerance. So all of these like scientific bases were used to explain the fact that like the Earth was kind of like a homeostatic regulating creature. But it was definitely a very controversial idea at the time when it came out and was attacked by a lot of critics because they were saying, I don't know if the word like teleological would work here, but he was kind of trying to say that there was a final cause that existed in nature and that the Earth itself was working towards promoting that cause, and that the Earth itself was trying to make itself a more hospitable biosphere for things to live, and trying to make conditions optimal as possible for everything. And yet, that was kind of arguable because conditions that are optimal, there's like a huge range for different creatures, and obviously some haven't survived. And so a lot of people were kind of against this, and they had two main conferences back then where it was like a pretty heated debate between people who believed in this idea and people who didn't. But it was just kind of an explanation as to why there's life here, but we can't explain why we can't find life anywhere else. And it's interesting actually because when I initially was looking into this theory, hypothesis, whatever you want to call it, I kind of thought it was something that ended back in the 1970s because it seems like a little bit of a ridiculous idea that the Earth is like the most giant creature you could find and that it somehow regulates its own conditions. But actually, I was reading about it, and apparently Lovelock published a book in 2006, which is pretty recent, called The Revenge of Gaia, and he's now using his Gaia hypothesis as a means of explaining climate change, and saying that because we as humans have disrespected this creature that we are technically a part of, it's like we're kind of a malfunctioning organ of some sort within Gaia, that whatever, is unable, because of deforestation and reduction of biodiversity and all these things that we've done, she can't minimize the effect of like the carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere anymore. And so that is why we're having these issues of climate change. So I thought this was really interesting, and apparently there's still some pretty strong followers of this theory. And I mean, I guess there is some scientific basis to why it could be valid. But I don't know, do you guys have any thoughts about, I mean, are you believers or this Gaia idea?
What do you mean by, what does he mean by creature? Like just some kind of self-regulating
Yeah.
thing?
And he initially, I think people found it hard to believe because you think of the Earth as being made up of a crust and like largely being rock. But then he set up an analogy with like a redwood tree, and if you looked at that, just not thinking that it was a life, it would just look like wood. And yet it's grown and has like caused other things to grow. And so he set up this analogy between trees and the Earth. And it's just this idea that the Earth, it's not like, we can't think of the Earth as a creature because we're actually part of it. So it's not just the living organisms, everything works together to regulate like atmospheric conditions, and it's interesting what he came up with. And like I think there's in a lot of the books there's some pretty extensive research that was done, so it's not just kind of a crazy idea.
Yeah, there's a lot of atmospheric research and large-scale climate research that he participated in, and he's a legitimate scientist, and certainly his work has been cited and been used to advance understanding. But yeah, the idea that things are somehow converge into a unity, and I think Gaia was a word that he didn't invent, but somebody he knew suggested to him, and he used Gaia. And by personifying this whole process, it sort of got a little out of control, because people started talking about this, life force and this, And a lot of these people were not necessarily people who were scientifically interested in, but they were interested in finding kind of arguments for, the unity of nature and the life force of nature. And then we get back to the sort of anthropocentric, using the human entity to think of nature itself. And we're back into the realm of Paley in some sense, because those types of arguments definitely go beyond any science. But there is a lot of science still around Lovelock's work, and climate science is a big field these days, and the study of patterns and the way in which atmospheric changes are stimulated by the amount of sunlight coming through the cloud cover and so forth. It's an area of tremendous interest right now.
And there is something that I read, and I don't know quite where they got this number, but apparently since life began on Earth, the energy supplied by the sun has increased by like 25 to 30%, and yet apparently the mean global surface temperature has, like, relative to that increase in energy from the sun, has remained fairly constant from where you'd expect it to have gone. So that's like another one of the reasons why it seems as though there must be some kind of regulation going on.
So, and then somebody could say, well, this regulation is actually being carried out by, On the other hand, a climate scientist would say, well, there's a process of in which these feedbacks are stimulating other effects and so on and so forth. And yeah, there's a certain kind of equilibrium that seems to have been maintained over a long period of time. And that equilibrium happens to be something we can live in as humans. But that doesn't necessarily justify concluding that, well, as Paley might, that, well, that equilibrium is a sign that, somebody's looking out for us and is, there's some...
I'm just curious, does he believe that there are other creatures like out there in the universe, or that Earth is the only one?
I think from what I read, he was using this to explain why there is life here and why in other places where we have been able to examine the conditions, there isn't. I don't know what his thought is about whether or not there are other such entities. I'm not really sure. That's an interesting question there.
I think it works, his idea works a lot better in the context of just a system and systems biology rather than as a global life force, where it can be almost universally agreed that there are feedbacks and the way that the Earth is self-regulated, but the claiming that because it does that, it's one new life form or whatever he calls it, is sort of akin to how Paley says, because this is so complex, it has to be creator or supreme being or whatever.
So because this is regulated, it must be alive.